You've scripted the reunion in your journal so many times the pages have started to curl, done the SATs exercise before bed, felt the imagined embrace, fallen asleep in the feeling of the wish fulfilled, just like the books tell you to. Caught yourself smiling at nothing in a grocery store because for 3 seconds you forgot you were practicing and just believed it. And then he texts back 4 words, or she goes quiet for 6 days. Or he's warm on Tuesday and gone by Friday, and you're back at your phone at midnight asking the algorithm what it means when an SP runs hot and cold. Here's the thing nobody wants to hear. The technique isn't the problem. You've been assuming the wrong thing this whole time. Not the wrong outcome, the wrong identity. No amount of correctly imagined dialogue outruns an uncorrected self-concept. This isn't a video about getting your specific person to text first. If that's why you clicked, you'll be disappointed, because that question sits downstream of something most manifestation content never names correctly. When your SP goes warm, then distant, then warm again, tracking nothing you can predict, what's actually producing that? Not what he's doing, not what she's feeling, what's being reflected and from where. Start with what you probably already half know. Most people doing SP work have gotten this part roughly right without understanding why it works when it works. Assumption, in Goddard's sense, isn't visualization the way people use that word casually. It's not picturing a scene like a movie behind your eyes. In Feeling is the Secret, 1944, Goddard is specific. The technique isn't to see the wish fulfilled, it's to feel it as already true, as the dominant state of the body. He called it the state akin to sleep, a relaxed hypnagogic state where imagination gets more vivid than the physical senses, and an impression made there behaves, in his model, the way a suggestion behaves under hypnosis. It bypasses argument. It doesn't need your intellectual agreement. It just needs repetition, sensorially, until the nervous system stops treating it as imagined and starts treating it as remembered. That's mechanism, not metaphor. It's part of why the technique actually works often enough that millions of people keep doing it. A felt impression, repeated in a state of reduced critical faculty, gets encoded something like real autobiographical memory does. This is close to what memory researchers call reconsolidation. Karim Nader's work at McGill in the early 2000s showed that every time a stored memory gets reactivated, it doesn't come back out intact. It goes briefly labile, chemically open to revision, before locking back into storage. Activate the felt sense of "he already chose me" enough times, calmly enough to bypass the part of you arguing back. And you're not pretending anymore. You're functionally inside the window where a self-referential belief can actually update instead of just repeat. Call that layer 1. Most SP practitioners are doing some version of it, correctly enough, with real and sometimes dramatic results. And the hot and cold pattern still shows up for a huge number of people who are doing layer 1 exactly right. So there's a second mechanism underneath it. Almost nobody scripting at midnight has ever been told to look for this one. Layer 1 asks what you're assuming about the outcome. Layer 2 asks something else entirely. What are you assuming about yourself underneath that? And is that buried assumption actually the thing steering the field? Get specific here. When you assume the feeling of "he already loves me," you're not just installing a belief about him. You're stacking it on top of an existing structure, your prior self-concept, the identity you've been running, sometimes for years, sometimes since long before this person showed up. If your operating identity is "I'm chosen easily, without effort," the new assumption lands on solid ground. But if the identity underneath your scripting is closer to "I have to work for love," or "people eventually pull away from me," or "I'm too much or not enough and eventually they notice," your nightly SATs session is asking your nervous system to hold 2 contradictory states at once. One is conscious, vivid, well-rehearsed. "He's mine, it's done." The other is older, automatic, structural. "I'm the kind of person this doesn't happen for." And when 2 assumptions are competing, it's not always the louder one that wins. It's usually the one that's been around longer. That's the mirror principle, and Goddard wasn't being vague about it. In his 1954 lecture series, The Law and the Promise, he made the claim this channel keeps coming back to. Everyone is yourself pushed out. Not a poetic flourish, a structural claim about perception. He meant the people in your life aren't autonomous data points reacting to you from some neutral outside position. They're They're filtered through and shaped by the assumption you're holding about who you are in relation to them. Your SP's hot and cold behavior isn't a fact you're passively observing. It's the shape your own divided identity takes once it gets pushed out into a relational field. You're not manifesting a person. You're meeting an unresolved internal argument wearing his face. There's a piece of advice that floats around manifestation spaces constantly, and it deserves a closer look, because it's usually sold as the fix and is really just half of the layer 1 mechanism. Let go. Detach from the outcome. Not wrong exactly, but almost nobody explains the mechanics, which is why it disappoints people so often. Detachment works, when it works, because anxious monitoring, checking his last scene, rereading old texts, refreshing for a notification, is itself a repeated rehearsal of absence. Every check whispers, "It's not true yet," fighting directly against last night's SATS session. Detachment just stops feeding that. What it doesn't do is touch the deeper identity. You can quit checking the phone entirely, get genuinely outcome independent, and still be carrying the belief that closeness doesn't last for people like you. Detachment removes interference. It doesn't revise the older signal underneath it. That's why letting go sometimes produces a real, brief opening. The field settles because the competing rehearsal stopped, and then the same pattern comes back once the old identity finds a new way in. Sometimes through a different relationship entirely. Sometimes years later, different name, same structure. There's a reason this hits harder in romantic projections than almost anywhere else, and it has a name in a totally different field. Jung's anima and animus, worked out most fully in Ion, 1951, describe the unconscious contrasexual image each person carries, the internal figure of whatever feels missing or unintegrated in the self, projected outward onto a romantic figure with unusual force. Precisely because romance is where that image gets activated hardest. Part of why SP fixation feels disproportionate, even to the person feeling it. You're not just attracted to him. You're meeting an externalized piece of your own psyche through him, which is exactly why his behavior feels like it's reporting something about you, at a depth ordinary interactions never reach. The intensity isn't proof of a special soul connection, whatever the manifestation community wants to call it. It's proof of how much unintegrated material got loaded onto one external figure. So, think about what this means for the pattern almost every SP practitioner describes. Not rejection, not indifference, oscillation. Hot, cold, hot again. No trigger you can name. That's two competing assumptions taking turns running the show. On the days your conscious assumption is strong, I'm loved, it's done, recently rehearsed, the field organizes around that. And he's warm, responsive, present. On the tired days, the triggered days, the days you're not actively holding the felt state, the older identity takes back over, and the field organizes around that instead. And he goes quiet, distracted, unreachable, confirming precisely the belief you weren't actively overriding that day. You're not manifesting inconsistency. You're reflecting it with disturbing accuracy, because the mechanism doesn't care which assumption you'd prefer. It reflects whichever one is actually running. Worth pausing on what running means here, because it's carrying a lot of weight. An identity doesn't have to be something you'd consciously sign off on if asked. Nobody, asked outright, says, "I believe closeness is temporary for me." Most people would deny it and mean the denial. Operative just means this is the default prediction under low oversight, late at night, under stress, when nothing's actively revising it. You don't have to believe a thing for it to be operative. You just have to have stopped overriding it. This is the part just believe harder misses completely. You were never fighting disbelief. You were fighting an older belief that never asked your permission to keep running. Here's a second case, because the pattern repeats almost eerily once you know what to look for. A man, by his own account, has mastered the techniques, drops into the state akin to sleep on command, scripts with precision, feels the reunion vividly, wakes up some mornings genuinely certain it's done. His SP responds, 2 weeks, sometimes 3. Then, no identifiable trigger, the distance comes back, and he reads it as proof the technique stopped working, so he scripts harder, adds sessions, more affirmations, more detail. The distance doesn't close, not because the technique broke, because the technique was never the variable that needed more force. Underneath the script, this man's carrying an old specific identity, not the generic "I'm unlovable" that manifestation content usually flattens shadow work into. Something more particular. Closeness is temporary, and I'm the one who eventually gets left. That identity doesn't need conscious belief to run. It just needs to stay unexamined, and every time the relationship stabilizes long enough to feel safe, the old identity reasserts itself, precisely because safety is the condition under which it's historically gotten violated, and the field reflects the reassertion back as distance, with mechanical accuracy. Now, the part that actually changes what you do next, because layer 2 isn't the floor either. There's a third mechanism, and it's why the buried identity is so hard to spot from inside your own head, and why being told it's your subconscious was never specific enough to actually fix anything. This one's the reticular activating system. Manifestation content has flattened it into a slogan, so it's worth being exact. The RAS sits at the base of the brainstem and filters incoming sensory information before it reaches conscious awareness. It doesn't filter randomly, it filters by relevance, and relevance gets set by whatever the brain's already flagged as significant. Threats, goals, anything confirming an existing self-model. Nothing mystical about it. Same architecture behind why you suddenly see a particular car everywhere after you buy one. The cars were always there. Your filter just wasn't tuned to flag them. Apply that to identity, and it gets sharper fast. If your operative self-concept includes "eventually they pull away," your RAS isn't a neutral camera recording what your SP does. It's already weighted to flag distance and silence as significant, and to write off warmth as noise, a fluke, until the cold day shows up and gets logged as the real him. The filter isn't passive, it's causal. It doesn't show you reality and let you draw your own conclusion. It pre-selects which reality you even get shown, in service of an identity nobody ever asked it to question. Here's where this stops being just plausible and starts being precise, because there's a separate body of psychology research converging on the same structure from a completely different angle. No Goddard, no manifestation in sight. Robert Cialdini at Arizona State spent decades documenting what he called identity-consistent behavior. People will act, interpret ambiguous information, even override their own stated preferences just to stay consistent with an existing self-concept, often at real cost to their own interests. That's not a manifestation claim. That's behavioral psychology. But think about what it implies. If you're unconsciously organized around the one who works too hard for love, consistency pressure doesn't just bias what you notice, it can bias what you do, the anxious texts instead of secure ones, the subtle testing, the unconscious pulling away when things go too well, because too well doesn't fit the model. The hot and cold pattern, in plenty of cases, isn't purely passive reflection. It's partly co-produced by behavior you don't consciously clock as gathering evidence for a belief you never consciously chose. This is also, structurally, projection. Jung described it with a precision that predates Goddard's public lectures and lands on strikingly compatible conclusions from a totally separate intellectual line. In Ion, he lays out shadow projection. The unintegrated parts of the self don't just sit there quietly. They get projected outward, attached to another person, then experienced as if they were objective qualities of that person, rather than disowned pieces of your own psyche. Jung's clinical observation was that the intensity of an emotional reaction to someone is often diagnostic of how much shadow material the projection is carrying. The more charged your reaction to his coldness, the more likely that coldness has been recruited to hold something unresolved that predates him entirely. Not identical to Goddard's "everyone is you pushed out," but structurally the same machinery named from inside clinical psychology instead of a lecture hall. Two completely separate traditions describing the same architecture. What you haven't integrated about yourself, you meet again in the people around you, amplified, and mistake for their nature. Worth getting precise about what shadow work actually is, because the manifestation world has worn that phrase down into something vague. Journal about your wounds, forgive your inner child, without ever explaining what the work actually does. Shadow integration, in the Jungian sense, means consciously identifying and reclaiming the disowned material you've been projecting outward, so it stops needing an external figure to carry it. Applied here, that means finding the specific belief about yourself that the SP's coldness keeps confirming, not in vague terms, but the exact sentence your nervous system is running and bringing it into conscious view clearly enough that it stops operating on autopilot. The work isn't feeling better about him being distant. The work is making the distance unnecessary as proof, because the thing it was proving has already been found and changed at the source. This also reframes a phrase that gets thrown around constantly in SP circles without explanation: the test. Practitioners get told that right before a manifestation lands, the universe sends a final test, a cold stretch, a discouraging sign, a moment of maximum doubt to check how strong your belief really is. Not entirely wrong, but it puts the mechanism outside you, something administered to you rather than inside you, something you're generating. There's no examiner timing a cold streak against your resolve. What's actually happening is more precise and a lot more useful. The cold stretch is the older identity reasserting itself, right when the thing it was built to prevent gets within reach. Calling it a test from the universe makes it something to survive. Recognizing it as your own old identity surfacing on schedule makes it something to revise. Completely different action. Goddard gave this an actual technique, and it's worth naming instead of leaving "revise your identity" floating as an abstraction. He called it revision, deliberately reconstructing a past event in imagination. Replayed not as it happened, but as it should have happened, held with enough sensory and emotional detail that it's felt, not just thought. Applied to this layer, revision isn't aimed at the relationship with your SP at all. It's aimed at the originating scene, the actual remembered moment, often years before this SP existed, where closeness doesn't last, for people like me, first got installed hard enough to become structural. Revising that scene, with the same SATS precision you'd use for any assumption, is how the underlying identity actually changes, instead of getting talked over by a louder, more recent affirmation. It's also why the 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off pattern almost never resolves through more scripting about the SP. You'd be aiming at the wrong scene. One more finding worth naming because it explains something the identity mechanism alone doesn't fully cover, and a careful account doesn't skip the messy parts. BF. Skinner's work on variable reinforcement schedules found that behavior reinforced unpredictably, sometimes rewarded, sometimes not, on no fixed schedule, produces stronger, more persistent engagement than behavior reinforced every time. Solid, well-established finding and genuinely relevant here. The unpredictability itself is reinforcing, independent of identity. But keep the calibration straight. This explains why the pattern is compelling. It doesn't explain why the pattern shows up in the first place. The reinforcement schedule is what keeps you fishing once the fish is already on the line. The identity mechanism is what put the line in the water to begin with. Now, the full calibration, because honesty matters here, and these things sit at different levels of certainty. The reticular activating system as a perceptual filter is settled neuroscience. Cialdini's identity-consistent behavior and Skinner's variable reinforcement are well-replicated psychology, solid descriptions of how self-concept and unpredictability shape behavior, not physical laws. Jungian projection is a clinical framework, widely used and clinically useful, but not falsifiable the way a controlled experiment is. And Goddard's actual metaphysical claim that external reality is literally, causally, the externalized content of consciousness itself, not just your perception of reality, is a philosophical and mystical position, not a scientific one. What can honestly be said? The structure Goddard described in 1954 and the structure Carl Friston's predictive processing framework would later formalize are functionally the same. Friston's model says the brain doesn't passively receive reality. It generates a continuous prediction about what it expects to perceive, then samples incoming data, mostly to confirm or slightly adjust that prediction rather than build it fresh each time. The gap between prediction and signal has a name: prediction error. And the organism is constantly working to close it, either by updating the prediction to match reality, learning, or by acting on reality to make it match the prediction, which is structurally manifestation under a different name. Whether Goddard would have put it that way doesn't matter to the convergence. A mystic working from feeling state and a computational neuroscientist working from Bayesian math arrived at the same architecture independently. You don't perceive a world and then form a belief about it. You hold a belief, often outside conscious access, and the world you perceive gets built to match it. And where the match fails, you're already biased to act in whatever way fixes the gap. Put the layers together, and the opening pattern resolves completely. Layer 1, assumption done right, installs a vivid felt belief. He's mine. It's already true. Layer 2, the mirror principle, sharpened by anima and animus projection in romance specifically, shows that belief isn't running alone. It's competing with an older, structural identity. And the field reflects whichever one's currently winning, which is why the result oscillates instead of settling. Layer 3, the RAS, Cialdini's research, Jungian shadow work, and the real but secondary role of variable reinforcement all point at the same finding while staying honest about which parts are neuroscience, which are solid psychology, and which are philosophy. The older identity wins as often as it does because it never announces itself. It works quietly, through what you notice and what you do, without realizing its self-sabotage, recruiting your SP's actual choices to confirm a self-concept you never agreed to and almost never examine. So, this reframes manifesting your SP completely. In a way, surface-level content never quite reaches, because surface content treats the SP as the target and the assumption as the tool. The real version is colder and more useful. The SP isn't the target. The SP is closer to an instrument reading. The hot and cold pattern isn't a verdict on whether you're lovable, and it's not random behavior from someone unpredictable you have no access to. It's a live readout of which identity's currently dominant in you, the one you scripted at midnight, or the one quietly running the show since long before you knew his name. Revise the surface assumption all you want. Until the underlying identity gets found and actually changed, not affirmed over, not visualized past, but located and revised at the level of self-concept, the field keeps reflecting both signals, and the SP keeps oscillating between them, because that's what an accurate mirror does when you show it two contradictory faces. What changes the pattern isn't more scripting, not a longer SATS session, not a more vivid scene. It's finding the specific sentence the older identity's been running, not, I want him to choose me, that's a desire, but the belief underneath it, something closer to, I'm the kind of person this eventually stops happening for. Find that sentence. Revise it with the same felt state precisions Goddard describes for any assumption, and that's your actual operating variable. Not the relationship, not the script, the self-concept. The script was quietly competing against the whole time. It's also why generic affirmations fail where specific revision works. I am worthy of love is too broad to overwrite a belief that was never that abstract to begin with. Your nervous system didn't encode unworthy. It encoded a specific story, usually with a scene attached, and it only updates for a revision precise enough to reach that exact scene. The woman from the opening, checking her phone at midnight after months of doing the technique right, wasn't failing at manifestation. She was succeeding at it perfectly, on two channels at once. One she'd built on purpose, one nobody ever told her to look for. The hot stretches were her assumption working exactly as designed. So were the cold ones, just a different assumption. Neither was an accident, neither was him. The mechanism doesn't need his behavior to cooperate. It needs her identity to stop being divided. Do that, and the field doesn't get kinder. It gets accurate, to a self that finally has one story instead of two. It's also why so many SP stories that do resolve don't resolve the way people expect. The relationship that finally settles rarely settles because the other person got convinced of anything. It settles because there's nothing left for the oscillation to confirm. Once the older identity gets found in its original scene and revised there, the field's only got one signal left to reflect, and one signal doesn't produce hot and cold. It produces consistency, because consistency was never actually being withheld by the SP. It was being withheld by the divided self he was accurately reading the whole time. People describe the shift as the relationship suddenly feeling easy, and credit the other person for changing. More accurately, the mirror just stopped getting two conflicting images handed to it. Neville said it plainly, and everything psychology and neuroscience have found since has only sharpened it. You don't get what you want. You get what you are. Your SP was never the variable. He was the mirror. He was always just reading back, with uncomfortable precision, exactly which one of you showed up.